and the opening speaker for just laying the foundation for why we are here today. It made me understand why he did invite me, and my entire practice as a curator. I think that the discussions are so informative and they're so educational that I feel like I'm actually having lessons. I literally am having lessons just listening to all the speakers that have been up so far. And I just want to give you guys a little bit of a base about what I am before I go into the paper. So currently I am the acting chief curator and collections curator for the National Art Gallery of Namibia. But I am busy. I'm in my final year of my PhD, and my PhD is an autoethnographic practice of trying to decide if I had a choice. When I was going from primary school to high school. So I was born in the colonial times, and then the grade 1 school I attended was in my indigenous language, which is Kwekwekowap. And when independence came in 1990 and I had to go to another school because my dad was an educationalist, he was a school teacher, then he took me to the colored school because that's now the next step where you could kind of go. And then when I had to choose a high school, and then he said to me, no, you're going to the German school. And I said, no, I am going to the English school because I could speak English, And then he said, no, you're gonna go to that German school and you're gonna learn everything they know. And it kind of set the trajectory for the rest of my life, where I am now at a place after I did my master's at the same university Raphael studied in London, where I asked myself the question, would I have been in the industry which I am in, practicing curating, an African art curator, would I have done that if I had not gone to that German school? And having the choice not to choose what I want to do with my life, where would I want to see myself and how would I want to position myself? And what are these changes I would like to make? And my entire research is informed by these questions. And I had a couple of conversations, online conversations with Raphael, but I've known Raphael since 2015, when he came to offer training to the curators at the gallery, and then thereafter he realized, oh, I'm at the same university where he was when I was doing my master's study. And my master's study focused on connecting the indigenous knowledge with the objects. So it's looking at the Khoisan heritage of whom I'm of inheritance, and the classification systems, which I am also misclassified because of the forced removals, etc. So I'm going to go into that into the paper, but then looking at all of those connections and trying to draw the parallels that exist so that the information and the objects are presented with the indigenous knowledge that it is needed to present these objects, so that we don't look at objects just positioned in space, but we are looking at objects as in what is their actual meaning. And the colonial building, obviously, that we inherited, is that the space where we need to be presenting these objects, and if not, where would they be? And then after I had now done the master's study, I moved on with a PhD and asking these questions. That's where I applied for the Met Fellowship. So I'm currently a fellow within the Modern and Contemporary wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. However, it's literally just asking questions, and the fellowship that they qualified me for is an interdisciplinary fellowship. The letter reads, and this is part of the dichotomy of continuously, where do you fit? Are you in Africa or are you in modern and contemporary wing, Are you an African, or do you have to put on a different mask so that they can listen to you and hear what you say? Do you have to sound a particular way so that you can command that attention, so that you can make these changes you want to make? Or do you who is it that you need to be at that given moment so that you can have that opportunity to present and speak on those things that are important? I think Raphael offering this conference does exactly that, where we can say it as it needs to be said without it being diplomatically correct, so that you can just voice and be heard, and so that it's a situation where we say Africa is speaking, and the time is now for us to construct a unified narrative of what we want and who we are as a people. I mean, the borders were colonial constructs, and the fact that we are breaking those borders intentionally through the institutions, using our objects to address these situations and environments that we find ourselves in, and how we can break free from them, I feel is a powerful place that all of us finding ourselves today are honestly privileged to be at, and to have a platform as such presented to us. That's just a little bit of, yeah, just so that you understand why I do what I do, and why I'm here. So I hope you don't mind that I removed the mask. As they circulate through our lives, we look through objects to see what they disclose about history, society, nature, or culture, ultimately what they disclose about us, but we only catch a glimpse of things. I live by this quote by Bill Brown. Curating is not what I do. It is in the essence of who I am. Art, music, history, the development of cultures, the legacies, interpretation, and its translation via the various modes of communication are what I am most passionate about. My curatorial practice is stemmed in deepening a sense of pride about history and forging a collective identity for the future. This objective aligns with the Aspiration 5 of Africa with a strong cultural identity of common heritage, values, and ethics, of the African Union Agenda for 2063 and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which commits all states to be a part of the new global impact that will leave no one behind. My research objectives employ platforms for identifying art, architecture, and design from the African continent and diaspora, and the cultural associations by leaning on Rebecca Solnit and Lucy Lippett's concepts of mapping and map making. I desire to continue mapping the heritage of my continent, its people, and the associations to tangible and intangible heritage through an ongoing process of oral history collating. This practice informs identity formations, looking at self-naming and being labeled and coming to terms with self-representation despite the shape-shifting identities we are forced to assume. And I say this because when the opening speakers spoke about name and the power of a name and what possesses your name, I decided, I never used to include it until after my master's study, but I intentionally include my second name, Dibasen, which means do it for yourself. And you kind of realize, yes, you kind of realize that there's a lot of power in a name that you keep carrying with yourself as you move, and that is what you live ultimately at the end of the day. Colonizing processes cannot be disentangled from the ethnographic practice of defining the local or the native or the marginalized and the underrepresented. Therefore, our African people's pursuit for decolonization cannot be disengaged from reclaiming indigenous histories as vehicles of ideological resistance to colonialism. The continued fragility of post-colonial democracy suggests that the omission of this factor from the larger literature on regime change should be rethought, and imperative to intentionally explore writings of canonical texts that will become universal epistemologies capable of writing the imperialistic wrongs of the past. I just want to elaborate. They present a paper, you do the academic writing, right? But in a nutshell, the current practice I'm engaging with, and especially at the Met, is to try and look at what has been written about art. What do they have in the collection that represents Namibia, that represents Africa, and then having contemporary creatives respond to those collections so that it becomes a looking at a historical, but then you are bridging the gap, collapsing the geography and the history, and then you have a contemporary perspective and representation of that similar object. At the same time, you are trying to make sure that the writings, because the research will have a various fora of output. So some will be artworks, others will be discussions, others will be workshops, and something else could just be a book at the end of the day, you know? It could be an exhibition at the end of the day. So you are looking at which way best to present that which you find as part of the research that you are engaging with, so that when we are writing, I've realized that with the history of the Khoisan, that when I write, you don't find material on it. For example, I come from a culture where my grandmother, they would make patchwork, and you don't find a lot of writing on it. However, there are artists that exist that are written about, you know, in the Med collection, that you are trying to put them in the same conversation. So we are not recreating a new book, but we are saying, no, we are adding this missing information in this dialogue to the existing pedagogy. Also, part of the practice that we did, and this was a project we ran, or we started running last year, which we showcased this year, beginning of the year at the National Art Gallery, was an exhibition titled #What's Your Story? And I'll share. My parents, they were not very keen on me choosing to study visual arts. So for them, it was a decision in, but you're gonna sit by the side of the road and sell your craft. I said, no, you don't understand that art in itself and art design. And when people spoke in the time of the pandemic of no essential services, now it's at home like, how can you not say that art is an essential service? Everything you are using on your phone is creativity, it's design, and the house that you are living under is architecture. That's part of design and art and creativity. Like the mug, the couch that you are sitting on, you would not regard that as an essential service. How would you have survived a pandemic if somebody didn't create those items, you know? And I would have these, it's very informal discussions, but I think people don't think of art in such a way. And my parents came from a background where all they had to choose was you become a nurse, you become a police officer, and what that means, so that they would have an appreciation for it. And the first way that I knew how to do it was incorporating socially conscious exhibitions as part of our showcase. So I started working for the gallery in 2011, and in 2012 I made a proposal, because we would, you know, as an art gallery with another skin color director, we would have abstracts only, you know, and then you're like, okay, it's not applicable and it's not relatable at all to my immediate audiences or public. So they would enter the space and not be able to engage with us where they are. So how is this space supposed to be a space that accommodates them and me in that essence? And that's where our first show that we tried to do was Unite to End Gender-Based Violence. Namibia was going through a very challenging time of violence and abuse, gender-based, but also just a lot of baby dumping and so on. So we partnered with the Ministry of Gender, we partnered with the Ministry of Health, so that we had valuable input in how to relay and communicate messages of, if you need help, where to go, so that this was all part of the educational branch of the exhibition, but its outputs. And we made the call very public, we made it very open. We said, we don't want just visual arts contributions, we want performance art, we want anybody who does music, if it's poetry. And then obviously at the end of the day, we had to figure out how do we present all of these items. So we had the entire 6 weeks long, every second day there was an activity taking place. So you find the best place where you're going to present this, if it's a poetry, if it's a dance, if people are enacting scenes of violence. I mean, we would go into shopping malls and restaurants and literally discuss with the managers and say, we're going to have this happening, it's going to be filmed, we want to have the reactions even of the public as part of the documentation. And they would actually allow us to do this in these spaces, which I thought was the most appropriate. There's one contribution that we had that I just want to mention. The lady said that she submitted it unanimous, but she said she was pregnant and her partner kicked her down the stairs, so she lost the baby. And in her having lost this baby, she had already bought some of the clothing, so she brought a dress. So for us, it's like, how do you present this? And one of the things we did, I said, okay, well, fine. I mean, it's a lost baby in essence. So we had fish line from the roof, and then we just had the dress, like the fish line woven into the corners of the dress, and then it was just floating as you enter the main gallery door. It literally just floating. It was doing this, just hanging by itself. And we had a plinth that was very low that you could only see the label that this is an artwork, so that you don't walk into it. And I mean, she walked in and she started bawling, you know. And on the opening night, right in front of her, we positioned a lady that, you know, it's normal, I think, in some cultures, if you have an abusive husband, she would sit and she would apply this makeup. And for her, she said it's something that she does on a regular. She would just apply makeup, move into the day, this is how I do it. So she did that as a performative piece on the opening night. I mean, I think people choosing to express themselves in those methods were so powerful. My parents are invited to the exhibition, and it was the first time they understood what stories we tell, that it doesn't just have to be stories of its work that you don't understand and you can't relate to, but that also has meaning. It allows people who can't put it into words to be able to translate it into an emotion, a color of choice that they use, that brings, I mean, if it's a red line running across that brings that tension, or that brings that moment of, oh my gosh, there's a danger lurking, you know, that's how they do it. So I was able to have a platform where immediately my own people could understand, oh, this is what this place is for. This is how stories are told in this space. And this is why it's important that our stories are told in that space. Because as a national gallery, it's important as an education space, serving from the youngest audiences to the academics themselves. And I think I just wanted to position where my background comes from and why I now ask the questions that I ask. I think I covered quite a bit just having the conversation with you guys. So, my history and the heritage that will be of point of focus, as part of this presentation, is that of the Nama Khoisan, of whom I am of descent. Nama, in older sources, also called Namakwa, an African ethnic group of South Africa, Namibia, and Botswana. They traditionally speak the Nama language of the Khoi-Kwadi language, although many Nama also speak Afrikaans. The Nama are the largest group of the Khoi people. Therefore, my reference of name used in this presentation is Nama Khoisan. The alternate found in the names of other Southern African nations like the Griqua, whom my grandfather was a descendant. So my grandfather, Sedekia Blessing Ucham, arrived in Namibia with the then Suid-Afrikaanse Weermacht, South African Police Department, as a speerder sergeant. The use of the Afrikaans terminology is of importance, according to my grandmother. Everything was in Afrikaans, and it is the imprint in her mind. You can see how she's remained with it, you know. She said, no, you have to put it in Afrikaans when I was interviewing her. He married my grandmother, Evelyn Uchams. Together they have 5 children, and my mother being the youngest. And they worked in Windhoek until he was shot dead in the call of duty. So my grandmother was Haman and lived with her husband Zedekia in Hoogland Park until the old location forceful removal. We refer to it as the old Lokasi. To Katutura, now Nama location, in Windhoek. So the old location was the product of social engineering, which had spatial components complementing racial policies of institutionalized discrimination. So the forceful, instead of going through the forceful removals, it was a situation where people were living in Hoogland Park, an area now referred to in Windhoek as Hoogland Park, which is a very affluent neighborhood. The square meter you would get for a house is larger. You could do gardening on it, for example, and these people were literally forced out of that space and told, no, you just have to move up there towards that mountain area. And in this forceful removal, a lot of people died. They were forced out with, you know, like the craters, you know, like their houses were flattened. And part of this forceful, for a number of reasons, most residents did not want to move. They had owned the Erven in old location, whereas in Katutura, all land belonged to the municipality. The newly allocated Erven were also a lot smaller than those in old location, effectively forbidding the creation of gardens. Also, economically, black residents were worse off after the move because they now had to pay rent to the municipality, and they needed a bus to reach their places of work in town. Old location had been in walking distance. Following protests and an effective boycott of municipal services by main location residents, the police opened fire on the protesters on 10 December 1959, killing 11 and wounding 44 others. This event is known as the Old Location Uprising. It is the reason for the declaration of December 10 Human Rights Day as a Namibian national holiday. The transfer to the new suburb took several years. My mother and her siblings were all relocated by my grandfather to Otjiwarongo, which is a town about 200 kilometers away from Windhoek. And my grandmother is currently still living in the house which my grandfather moved her to in that year. My grandmother was notified of her husband passing and went back to Windhoek to bury him. The dislocation and its entire dispensation which ensued had all my grandmother's children and grandchildren classified as Damara in the colonial rule. Subsequently, this entire lineage follows this classification, which I am of inheritance. These problems of definition and identity formation are bound up with the process of colonization. So as much as it applies for us as humans, it's been applied to also our objects that we are working with. This presentation serves in remembrance of our past and will contribute to our process of healing and a restoration of dignity of the Namakhoisan. There is a pain that travels generationally through the Namakhoisan families. Part of that healing is to embrace our history and embrace the pain and trauma that has informed it. There has to be a reckoning with our past. As we cannot continue to perpetuate this pain, and there was a recent documentary that was done regarding the genocide of the Nama and the Herero, and some of the ladies, you can hear the tears as they are speaking, but nothing is coming out of their eyes. But they would speak about how the colonizers at the time, when they would basically, if they would win over any of the clans that were rising up against them, so any of the leaders' heads would be decapitated, which was part of the discussion earlier, and all of these heads would then be given to the wife or the mother, and they would be given a blade and told, and this would happen in the church, they would be given this head of your person, and you had to remove the skin off of the skull. And these ladies, when they were interviewed, they would remember that these were processes that they went through, or that their mothers went through, and they would sit and watch, and they would, it's such a painful process, because then the skull would be taken and just be thrown into a crate that then they would be shipping across to Germany as trophies of that they've overcome, From Namibia, from January 1904, the German colony of Southwest Africa, since 1990, the sovereign state of Namibia, seethed with the repercussions of the greatest resistance movement against colonial rule the country had yet witnessed. The colonial administration had been gradually implanted after the Berlin Conference in 1884, which had sealed the partition of Africa among the European powers. A new brand of German radical nationalism began to echo the proverbial quest by the young Emperor William II for the sun, calling for establishment as a world power on a par with Britain, with a powerful fleet and an array of overseas colonies. Germany managed to grab only a few colonies in Africa and Oceania after 1884, which turned out to be dismal and costly commercial failures. Amongst the colonies acquired, Namibia was the only territory considered suitable for extensive settlement by Europeans. Settler ideology envisaged the creation of a new Germany. If you visit Namibia now, you try and just go to the town of Swakopmund. It's like a little Germany that exists within Namibia. Under such circumstances, any challenge to colonial rule was tantamount to disparaging national honor and grandeur. At the same time, the quest for settlement translated into a sustained drive to expropriate Africans from their land and from their livestock. After the formal establishment of colonial rule in 1884, it took years to assert full or proper control. Only in 1895 did the Xhovesan, under the leadership of Hendrik Witbooi, succumb to the colonial troops. The charismatic chief tried to unite the leaders of the different colonial communities threatened by colonialism. The decade that followed was marked by Governor Lutwan's strategy to advance the settlement project and, in his own words, to gradually get the natives accustomed to the new dispensation. Of their former independence, nothing but memories will be left. The evidence is there in von Trotter's extermination orders. It is in the intergenerational memory of the descendants of those who were killed and those who survived. It is in the whispers of the hanging trees. It is in the bones that lie in the ground under houses in Ochinene, Swakopmund, and under the Independence Memorial Museum, which is built on the site of the infamous Oromborombonde concentration camp. On 4 October 1904, things took a new turn with the start of the Nama-German War in southern Namibia. The various Nama groups avoided a large-scale battle and managed to hold out much longer than the Ovaherero. General von Trotter responded by transferring his strategy of genocidal suppression to this region as well. His proclamation to the Nama explicitly cited the Herero experience. Larger Nama groups capitulated after Witbooi, by now an octogenarian, died in action more after the commencement of the uprising, but some carried on until 1908. Who gave themselves up to the Germans met similar fate to the surviving Herero. Contrary to earlier promises, they were made prisoners, men, women, and children and elderly people, indiscriminately were detained in concentration camps. They shared this fate with the surviving Ovaherero. These concentration camps were located largely in the relatively cold and moist climate of the two port towns of Swakopmund and Lüderitz. Unaccustomed to these conditions, underfed, ill-clothed, and badly accommodated, thousands of prisoners died from sheer neglect or from exertions as forced labor. Even after the war had officially been terminated, groups of Nama were transported to other German colonies in Africa, Togo, and Cameroon. Of these groups of deportees, many also died before they were repatriated shortly before the beginning of World War I. It is estimated that more than 20,000 Nama who lived in southern Namibia before the uprising, less than 10,000 survived these various forms of savage repression. One of the more appalling features of this mass destruction of human lives is the kind of open publicity the perpetrators may be said almost to have reveled in. Picture postcards were produced displaying in particular the concentration camps, design emerging in the midst of atrocities. The postcards from the German colony show an appalling disregard for human suffering, which could be conveyed, as it were, as a greeting to one's loved one at home. The same is true for color pictures showing scenes of prisoners being hanged or forced labor scenes representing native life of the so-called natives, as if it were natural for Africans to be subjected to inhuman treatment and the regular application of brutality and force. What they did was they would basically be sending home notes and design postcards, and they wrote books of the genocide from their perspective, as if it was a success story of how they overcame and claimed this land. And this material is available. You can find this material online. I mean, who took these pictures? It was them. And this is what is currently being told as the Namibian story. This is what everyone can see. The recent repatriation of human skulls has focused attention on the ways in which German public of the early 20th century was informed, including about the transportation of human remains from Namibia. One image reproduced on postcards and in book illustrations shows soldiers packing a crate with human skulls with a caption that these had been cleaned of their flesh by Ovaherero women using shards of glass. Participants in the Namibian delegation who went to Berlin in September 2011 to receive the skulls also recalled stories they had heard from their parents and grandparents who had gone through these ordeals. In Germany, these skulls became the material upon which academic careers were built. Such racial science became a mainstay of Nazi ideology and discriminatory practice. It is estimated that over 50% of the Nama people and 80% of the Ovaherero people were killed. General von Trotter's extermination order for the Ovaherero issued October 2nd, 1904. I quote, "I, the great general of the German troops, send this letter to the Hereros. The Hereros are German subjects no longer. The Herero people must now leave the land. If it refuses, I will force them with a great roar," the cannon. Any inside the German frontier, with or without a gun or cattle, will be executed. I shall spare neither women nor children. I shall give the order to drive them away and fire on them. These are my words to the Herero people. General von Trotter's extermination order for the Nama people issued April 22nd, 1905 read, and I quote, "The Nama who chooses not to surrender and lets himself be seen in the German area will be shot until all are exterminated. Those who at the start of the rebellion committed murder against whites or have commanded that whites be murdered have, by law, forfeited their lives. As for the few not defeated, it will fare with them as it fared with the Herero, who in their blindness also believed that they could make successful war against the powerful German Kaiser and the great German people. I ask you, where are the Herero today?" Unquote. It had profound political implications in that it was through defining societies as non-historical that colonial forces justified their presence in Namibia. They presented themselves as bearers of civilization who, by preaching good governance, Western literature, and philosophy, Christianity, and market economy, would lead the Namaquasan along the path to progress. We need to unearth the history, bring it to the light, and heal the wounds of the past. As a nation, it is impossible to build a future without righting the wrongs of the past and making sure that the knowledge of the past is availed to successive generations. If we don't tell these stories, and if my daughter doesn't hear it, she won't know what I had to go through so that she today can have an education system that is inclusive of African ways of creating and making, and that these should be taught in our universities. The project that we did recently was hashtag What's Your Story. It was a documenting of 82 Namibian visual artists, each in from blank canvas basically to what they would create at the end of the day, from concept, what their concept was and whether it translated into the final object, and their entire process, like, progress shots, everything was documented, and this is all on YouTube, like on the Nagan YouTube page. And I think it's tools that we try and create to make sure that people have material that they can write the educational curricula that can be used in order to teach Namibian history, Namibian ways of creating, African ways of creating, so that we don't, I was taught about Rembrandt, for example, so that my daughter doesn't have to go through the same fate that I did, but that she can have an appreciation of who John Mavengeo is now, and who Petrus Amuthenu and Mr. Medisia are, and who are all in the lineage of printmakers of Namibia, and that this history is what needs to be taught in our universities, in our schools, so that they can have this information available and readable. And as a practice, thanks, and as a practice, as a curator, that my choice to remain a curator is to make sure that those changes can take place, that even if it's just to sow the seed, that the next generation can come and water that seed, but that we take back and reclaim back what has been ours, and that we are the ones. I deal with my history, I deal with the Namaquasan, because that's where I come from. There's so much meaning lost in translation when you take something of another tribe and try and just translate it so that everybody understands it. So I deal with where I come from, and that's why it's an autoethnographic practice. And I think if each one doesn't, I ask the questions you ask, even with this research at the Met, the questions you ask is so that you can just get people's minds activated on something else. And that's all you can do, because at the end of the day, it will unfold as it may, but all you have is what you are now and what you do with that. And I want to thank you all for listening. Thank you.
The question disaster we have now in Cabo Delgado in Mozambique. These things that we just exposed are contained in advance in a poem that I did many years ago before I even knew you were coming. I did a poem called The Ghost of Marikana, and that was instigated by the massacre that was done in South Africa in Marikana. But one of the lines in that poem says, it's we, the Khoisan clan, whose plan they now want to clover. No wonder, the propaganda. But this time we can't take it no further. It's we, the Shona clan, whose land they now want to grab. No wonder, the propaganda. But this time we can't take it no further. It's we, the Yoruba clan, whose land and oil they now want to steal. No wonder, the propaganda. But this time we can't take it no further. The lines are on and on and on, and at the end of the line, you'll find the people who are saying these things are our spiritual leaders who are coming in saying these things as ghosts. Like, for example, one of the chanters of this song is the ghost of Martin Luther King. One of them is the ghost of Steve Biko. One of them is the ghost of Patrice Lumumba. These are the guys that are complaining. And you know what? There is no separation in reality between those artists of ours who have gone and us. There's no separation. We have engaged in now. We have been revitalized, regovernized, rejuvenated spiritually. And we are going to win this fight. And it's not going to be just about the borders. It's not going to be just about the minerals. It's going to be about our flora and fauna, all the medicines that they're looting from Africa, the herbs, have got all the treatments you can think of. They can even tell you, they push a matter, oh, this is the cancer, you cannot treat it. That is the global lie. I can tell you that. It's a lie. We have got the genetic bank for Africa for these trees is all over the place. So it is your responsibility now as this conference to dig deep and find out where we are going to light that fire. I'm sorry, time is jealousy. I'm looking for a female. There is no a female.
Thank you so much for that very dense analysis. The first time I ever read the Blue Book is basically the accounts of the genocide of the Harare people by the genocide of the Harare people by the Germans that the English published. You know, English being bad, being who they are. I was very surprised. But I read it. I think it was back in 1995, and I was just so shocked that I didn't know, that there was a genocide by the Germans in Africa, and that the Germans, and then I directed. I've been to the Mountaintop by Lazarus Jacobs, and we went on a national tour in Namibia, and we went to Marienthal, where they still have statuettes of Hitler that they sell in the grocery stores. Yes. And I remember we had a scene in this play by Lazarus Jacobs. It was a play about Martin Luther King going to Namibia after independence to see if it had changed after apartheid. And so we go to this Marienthal little store, and of course the German shopkeeper is horrified at all of these articulate black people coming into his store. So he locks the door. So all of the locals come out, and they all start because we had a scene about the Birmingham the African American bus boycott in Alabama. So suddenly all the actors started to perform, and then the local people also started to say boycott, and they would boycott, and they started to sort of and I think performance is a really, really good way in terms of reenactment and as an educational tool. Even in museums, I've animated the Barotse archives. through performance, through animating, looking at the photograph, understanding what's in the frame, breaking it down, and then recreating a scene out of that. And there's so many ways that you can engage your local communities and schools and your museum, you know, in discovering their history, but through experience it for themselves through dramatic whatever you want to call it. Yeah. Thank you.
Material culture that has still, like, you know, the residue of it that remains. Okay, I make example. There was a they call it the rider. So it was this huge monument that was standing in front of the National Museum. But this was when they won, and then this guy sitting on this horse, and then this monument, they put up this monument in front on this land, which was the Ombolombontu, the concentration camp. This area got turned into the National Museum. So obviously the discussions ensued that how do we change this? How do we make sure that we don't just keep having this rider remain on the land where there's still people, you know, and people's remains are still under there. And the minister agreed, they removed it. So it's currently standing in the back of the Altafesta, which is part of the National Museum. However, as part of that removal, you see, with the erasure of history, then my little one, who's now 7, will come and she will not know that it doesn't show the progression. It doesn't show that from this we move to this, and it's in that moment where we need to figure out how do we represent that. We don't want the rider, but there's gotta be a plaque or something we put up back to say, but this is why this change had to happen, because now we have the founding father of Namibia, the president, the then president Sam Nujoma, who is standing there with the constitution in his hand. And I mean, my dad would tell these stories where he would say things like, no, we were so nomadic, you know, like before they remained on my grandmother remained on the one farm, they would keep moving about. And it's like when your clock is the sun, like you've got to move with the season, because that's how you know, like in this area, this is what was happening. We can graze at this time. It becomes rainy season, so then we have to move so that we're not in the rain, because I mean, our home is our hut. We constructed ourselves from the woven, you know, so the woven reed. So like hearing him and majority of the family just tell me, I continuously ask the question so that you can just be recording and getting this information of what were the ways that we lived. I mean, medicine, you living off the ground, for example, type of a thing, and making how do we make sure that type of information remains? What do we use as that representative metaphor? And that time when we are educating, I had a colleague, I said to my CEO, when we were doing the water story, I said, I need help. Like, this project has become so big. I need someone who's here while I go document the rest of Namibia. You know? And then she managed to get one of the ladies who worked for a partner institution, but she's from the other skin, you know. And we stood and we stood in front of one exhibition. It was a panoramic view of a dune, and we stood in front of this, and then I said to her, so Elise, what are your views? And then she went, oh, I think it's really beautiful days. I said, that's a very over romanticized idea, right? This is, to me, lived land, because you look at who should have moved through there and what they probably went through at that time. So obviously where we come from is informed by that, and you highlighting so much what is it that we're going to use, and whether it's in film form or whether it's the reenactments that are just documented, that material somehow remains as a visible notion of this is the history. Yes, I don't want to see the rider. You've removed it. Yes, I understand. It's not what we are standing for anymore. But how do I make sure that my daughter understands that there was a rider, you know? That there was a rider, and why it was on that exact place, and why the change needed to happen. Because if she forgets, then that's where we lose everything. That's where we lose who we are as an African people. And I think that is a very important question. I think that is something, I think in the as part of the research, as part of the research in the responses, how we want contemporary creatives to respond, that would be ideal, to not make it a call only for visual artists, for example, but that it could be a response in any method that you deem, and that could be ways of interpreting how these moments can remain, that we have historical documentation of these moments. But thank you so much for that.
Yeah, someone was saying, this speaking tool, it needs to have its own duty and role, especially around 1 o'clock. So